Hey, my name is Victoria Ashford, and I'll never forget the evening when my brother's daughter, standing in the middle of my father's retirement celebration, raised her glass toward me and announced to the entire gathering that I was nothing more than the pathetic aunt who purchased affection because nobody would give it to me freely. The room went silent for exactly 3 seconds. Then, the laughter erupted like a wave crashing over me. My brother, Marcus Ashford, hovered his face with his hand, but his shoulders were shaking with amusement. My parents sat frozen at the head table, their eyes darting between me and everyone else, but they said nothing. Not one word of defense. Not even a gentle correction. A few relatives glanced my way with what might have been sympathy, but they quickly looked down at their plates, unwilling to interrupt the entertainment. I stood there near the dessert table, holding a slice of vanilla cake I'd been about to eat, feeling the weight of every chuckle, every whispered comment, every delighted gasp, as if they'd all been choreographed specifically for this moment. My niece, Natasha Ashford, wasn't finished. She went on, her voice gaining confidence with each sentence. She talked about how I always arrived at family events with expensive gifts, how I threw cash at everyone's problems because I had nothing else to offer, how I'd never managed to build a life of my own, so I was desperately trying to purchase a place in theirs. Someone in the back actually whistled in approval. Another voice called out that she was just speaking the truth everyone had been thinking. I could have responded. I could have told them exactly whose money had been keeping Natasha in her downtown loft, paying for her design courses, covering the bills that Marcus conveniently forgot existed every other month. But I didn't. I set the plate down on the nearest table, smoothed the front of my silk blouse, and walked out of that banquet hall without looking back. The drive home felt longer than it should have. My phone kept lighting up with text messages. Some said I was overreacting. Others said I couldn't handle a little teasing. A couple claimed Natasha was just joking around and I'd made it awkward by leaving. I ignored every single one. I kept my eyes on the road and let a single thought repeat itself in my mind until it became a promise. If they truly believed I was just the desperate aunt who bought love, they were about to discover what life looked like when I stopped paying for it. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. Long before everything shattered, my life had already been shaped around responsibilities that nobody else seemed willing to shoulder. The shift didn't happen all at once. It crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, like fog rolling into a valley until you can't see the road ahead anymore. I grew up in a coastal town in Northern California, where the economy rose and fell with the fishing industry. My parents were hardworking people who believed in loyalty, duty, and sacrifice. My mother kept a meticulous budget notebook that she updated every Sunday evening. My father worked 2 jobs most of my childhood, coming home smelling like diesel fuel and ocean salt. Money was always tight, but we learned not to ask for things we didn't absolutely need. Conversations about finances happened in hushed tones after I'd gone to bed, but I could still hear the tension seeping through the walls. When I left for university on a partial scholarship, I thought I was finally stepping into a life where I could focus on my own ambitions. I imagined myself free from the constant worry about unpaid bills and overdue notices. But responsibility has a way of following you, especially when you're the one who escaped. After I graduated with a degree in finance, I moved to Sacramento and landed a position at a mid-sized investment firm. Every promotion felt like validation. Every raise felt like proof that I was building something solid. What I didn't realize was that stability, when you're the only one who has it, becomes a magnet for everyone else's problems. The phone calls from home started small. My mother mentioning that the refrigerator was making a strange noise. My father hinting that his medication co-pays had gone up. They never asked directly at first. They just presented the problems and waited to see if I'd offer solutions. And I always did. I'd transfer money and tell myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until things stabilized. But things never stabilized. They just found new ways to crack. My older brother, Marcus, had always been the charming one, quick to laugh, quick to make promises, and even quicker to abandon them when things got difficult. He'd married young, had Natasha even younger, and spent the next decade bouncing between jobs that never quite worked out. His wife left when Natasha was 7, and after that, it was just Marcus trying to raise a daughter while barely managing to keep himself afloat. Marcus and I were never particularly close. We existed in different orbits, occasionally colliding during family gatherings, where we'd make polite conversation and then retreat back into our separate lives. But we shared an unspoken understanding that when things fell apart, someone in the family had to catch the pieces. And that someone was always me. Over the years, the requests became routine. An overdue electric bill, a car repair that couldn't wait, a security deposit for a new apartment after the last landlord evicted him. Each time Marcus would call with a sheepish tone, promising he'd pay me back as soon as he got his next check. He never did. I stopped expecting him to. When Natasha started talking about college, Marcus insisted she deserved the same opportunities I'd had. I agreed. She was bright, creative, and full of potential. But potential doesn't pay tuition, and Marcus didn't qualify for the loans she needed. My parents couldn't co-sign. They were already drowning in their own debts. That left me. I remember sitting in my apartment, staring at the financial aid documents spread across my kitchen table. Page after page of terms and conditions, interest rates, repayment schedules. Signing meant tying myself to her future in ways she might never understand. Not signing meant watching her end up in the same cycle of limitations that had trapped my parents and my brother. I signed. But it didn't stop with tuition. There were textbooks that cost as much as a month's groceries. There was housing near campus because the commute from Marcus's place was impossible. There were art supplies for her design classes, a laptop that could handle the software she needed, a monthly allowance so she wouldn't have to work full-time while studying. Every expense found its way to me, and because I still believed I was investing in someone's future rather than enabling their dependence, I kept saying yes. There's something that happens when you become the person everyone relies on. They stop seeing the effort behind your reliability. They stop noticing the extra hours you work or the things you give up to keep everything running smoothly. They only see the hand that's always there to catch them. They assume it always will be. By the time Natasha moved into her loft in downtown Sacramento, a significant portion of her life rested on my financial foundation, her lease, her tuition payments, her ability to focus on her studies instead of survival. Marcus thanked me once, in a voice that sounded more relieved than grateful, and my parents said I was doing what family does. I told myself that was enough. But something underneath it all was shifting. Not in them, in me. A quiet exhaustion was building. A realization that I was holding up more weight than I should, that I'd constructed an entire support system beneath people who rarely look down to acknowledge it. I didn't know it then, but every payment, every signature, every responsibility I absorbed was forming the foundation of a lesson they would learn the hardest way possible. Eventually, the day would come when I stepped back and let them stand on their own for the first time, and that day was closer than any of us realized. There's a moment after public humiliation when your brain stops replaying the scene and starts reorganizing itself into something sharper, clearer. That transformation happened to me the morning after my father's retirement party. Not as rage, though anger was certainly present, but as a lucidity I hadn't experienced in years. A sudden understanding that I'd been supporting an entire structure that nobody else had even bothered to examine. Once you see something that clearly, you can't unsee it. I sat at my kitchen island with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, letting the silence settle around me like a blanket. It felt like standing at the edge of a decision I'd been avoiding for far too long. My laptop sat closed beside me, the cursor on the screen blinking like a quiet invitation. There's a particular kind of power in not reacting immediately, in letting the dust settle before you make your next move. I wanted my actions to be deliberate, not impulsive, because impulsive decisions can be excused and forgiven. Deliberate ones cannot. When I finally opened my laptop, I didn't rush. I navigated through files, emails, saved documents, every digital thread connecting me to obligations that had somehow become permanent fixtures in my life. I started with housing. Natasha's loft existed because my financial credibility was attached to it. Without my backing, the walls around her stood on borrowed time. I pulled up the lease agreement and read through it slowly, absorbing every detail, not because I needed to understand it, but because I wanted to fully comprehend what I had allowed to happen. My name was listed on every significant page. Guarantor, responsible party, emergency contact. It was like looking at a blueprint of how completely I'd woven myself into someone else's existence. I found the property management company's email and composed a message. I didn't elaborate. I didn't justify. I simply stated that I would no longer be financially responsible for the unit and requested instructions for terminating my involvement. The words looked stark on the screen, almost as if someone stronger had written them. The moment I clicked send, something inside me loosened. Next came the tuition payments. I scrolled through the automatic payment settings that withdrew money from my account without requiring my attention. The rhythm of these deductions had become so normalized that I'd forgotten they were optional. It felt strange, almost liberating, to click the disable button. A small confirmation window appeared, asking if I was certain. I didn't hesitate. The window closed and the page refreshed, blank where the payment schedule used to be displayed. I leaned back in my chair and exhaled slowly. It wasn't triumph I felt. It wasn't revenge. It was a quiet reclamation. The first intentional step toward letting them live without the cushion I'd built beneath them. The notifications started almost immediately. Not from my family, but from the systems I'd just altered. The property management acknowledged my request and informed me that a financial review would be initiated. The university portal flagged the account as pending, a designation that carried implications none of them were prepared for. I closed the tabs one by one, feeling the weight shift off my shoulders with each click. For years, I'd convinced myself I didn't have a choice, that stepping back meant abandoning them. Now I understood the truth. They had never been standing on their own. They'd been leaning, and I had let them. I spent the rest of that afternoon moving through my apartment like someone rediscovering her own space. I organized my bookshelves. I watered the plants I'd been neglecting. I prepared a proper meal for myself instead of eating takeout at my desk. Small, mundane acts that felt grounding in their simplicity. My phone stayed face down on the coffee table, silent for now. I knew messages were coming, but I wasn't ready to see them yet. When the sun began to set, casting amber light through my living room windows, I finally picked up my phone. Dozens of notifications blinked to life across the screen. System updates from the property management company. Financial alerts from the university. Nothing personal yet. Just the administrative consequences of my absence rippling outward, announcing the shift before I did. I set the phone aside again. I didn't want to sit there waiting for the emotional fallout. Instead, I stepped out onto my balcony. The evening air was cool and steady, indifferent to everything happening in my life, and I found that comforting. I leaned against the railing and let myself imagine what it would feel like to stop cushioning every blow that landed on them. What would they do without the safety net they'd assumed would always materialize? They were about to find out. Later that evening, I opened my laptop again, not out of doubt, but to ensure I hadn't missed anything. I reviewed every account linked to my finances, every recurring charge tied to someone else's needs. With each cancellation, a new piece of my life returned to me. It struck me how quietly these obligations had attached themselves, how easily love becomes labor when nobody else steps in to share it. By the time I closed my laptop for the second time that day, the room felt different, lighter, as if I'd finally stopped dragging something heavy behind me. I knew the silence wouldn't last. Families like mine don't notice the support you give, but they certainly notice the moment it disappears. The financial systems were already adjusting to my absence. The emotional systems would follow soon enough. But for now, there was peace. An unfamiliar kind, the sort that comes from choosing yourself after years of choosing everyone else. This wasn't revenge, not yet. This was just the beginning, the quiet before the first ripple reached them. The shift didn't take long to reach them. It was almost unsettling how quickly silence on my end transformed into chaos on theirs. Not the kind that comes from genuine concern, but the frantic scrambling people do when the ground beneath them tilts and they can't figure out why. The first ripple arrived mid-morning, 2 days after I'd made the changes. A single vibration from my phone, then another, then a steady stream, as if someone had shaken it awake. I didn't reach for it immediately. There's a quiet power in choosing exactly when to look at the things that once controlled you. When I finally picked it up, the screen glowed with the kind of urgency people reserve for emergencies they created themselves. Marcus's messages were the loudest, short, frantic fragments packed with panic and indignation. He didn't ask what was happening. He demanded answers. He insisted something must be wrong with the payment systems, that I needed to fix it before everything fell apart, as if a technical glitch had suddenly made the world inconvenient for him. The entitlement in his words was so familiar, it almost made me laugh. Then came Natasha's notifications, each one pulsing with the boldness of someone who had never understood the value of what they received. Her tone swung wildly between disbelief and accusation. She wrote as if the universe had personally betrayed her, as if the disruption in her life couldn't possibly be the result of anything she'd done. There was something raw in her messages, the kind of unfiltered frustration people show only when they're used to every safety net catching them without fail. My parents' messages arrived last, not softer, but disguised as soft. My mother used careful phrasing, the type that pretends to comfort while still pushing for what she wants. My father kept his words brief, almost businesslike, as if removing emotion from the situation made it more reasonable. Both tried to anchor their concerns in family responsibility, in duty and obligation. Neither acknowledged the imbalance that had been growing for years. I put the phone down and stood in the middle of my living room, letting their messages hang in the air, like a chorus demanding my attention. There was a time I would have rushed to fix everything, guilt flooding through me faster than logic. Not anymore. There's a difference between being needed and being used, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. As the day stretched on, their panic escalated. Marcus called repeatedly. The ringing felt almost performative, as if each attempt was meant to signal his frustration more than his actual worry. Natasha doubled her messages, layering blame with self-pity, crafting herself as the victim of circumstances she couldn't control. My parents shifted into their familiar pattern. Guilt, wrapped in reason, concern layered over expectation. I ignored all of it. Toward the afternoon, a new wave arrived, sharper and unmistakably rehearsed. Marcus had switched tactics. He wrote as if he were above the chaos, as if he alone were holding the family together, while I apparently tried to tear it apart. He painted a picture where I was impulsive, emotional, irresponsible, the very traits he'd embodied for decades. It was almost impressive how quickly he rewrote the narrative, casting himself as the steady one and me as the problem. I recognized the tactic immediately. When people lose the pedestal they've built on someone else's labor, they claw at whatever they can to rebuild it. But I wasn't climbing back up. I had stepped off entirely. 3 days later, the messages changed tone again, not softer, just more strategic. Marcus suggested we clear the air, phrasing it like an invitation instead of a demand. He wanted to meet for brunch, neutral ground, just the immediate family. A chance to talk like adults, he said. Everything about it felt calculated, but curiosity has its own pull. Not toward reconciliation, but toward clarity. I wanted to see what they would do when forced to face me without the shield of a group text or the safety of distance. So I agreed. On Sunday morning, I arrived at the restaurant Marcus had chosen, a place with Edison bulbs and chalkboard menus, the kind of spot that tries too hard to feel casual. The moment I stepped inside, I knew there was no neutrality here. Marcus wasn't alone. My parents sat stiffly at the end of the table, hands folded in front of them like they were bracing for impact. And beside them, leaning back in her chair with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, was Natasha. The expression on her face wasn't remorse. It wasn't confusion. It was irritation. As if I'd inconvenienced her by forcing her to deal with consequences she'd never believed would come. For a brief second, everything in me went still. Then something softened. Not in forgiveness, but in understanding. This was never going to be a conversation. It was an ambush disguised as concern. A performance designed to funnel me back into the role they preferred. Dependable, silent, absorbent. I didn't sit down. I didn't say a word. I simply turned and walked out the same way I'd walked out of that banquet hall days before. This time, though, there was no sting, no humiliation, only certainty. Behind me, I heard chairs scraping against the floor, someone calling my name, the clatter of silverware shifting across the table. But I kept moving. The air outside felt different, cleaner, lighter, as if I'd stepped out of a room filled with smoke I'd never noticed until it cleared. Families often rely on rituals to restore order. A meal, a gathering, a talk. But rituals only work when the people involved actually want to change. They didn't. And I was done mistaking their panic for love. The quiet after the brunch ambush didn't last long. It never does when people who've been relying on you suddenly realize the leash they've been tugging no longer reaches them. The shift began subtly, like the temperature dropping before a storm rolls in, then surged into something fierce enough to rattle the calm I'd carefully carved out for myself. It started the following morning, long before sunrise, when most of Sacramento was still wrapped in darkness. A string of notifications stacked themselves across my phone screen in rapid succession. I didn't have to open them to know the tone had changed. Panic always comes first. Rage follows close behind. This time, the messages didn't disguise themselves as concern or family obligation. They came sharpened, deliberate, heavy with resentment that had clearly been waiting for the right moment to surface. Marcus's words read like someone stripping away the mask he'd worn for years. Accusations polished with self-righteous certainty filled paragraph after paragraph. He framed my silence as aggression and my boundaries as betrayal, emphasizing how much strain I was putting on the entire family. Every sentence pulsed with the assumption that I was responsible for restoring the balance he believed belonged to him by default. He wrote as if I'd stolen something from him, as if my money had always been his money, just temporarily housed in my account. Then came the next wave from my parents, their attempts at moral pressure carefully constructed to make me feel like the villain in a story they'd rewritten overnight. Their messages painted me as the source of all disruption, the destabilizing force in an otherwise functional family unit. It was bewildering how easily they glossed over the years in which I had held everything together. My absence was the only part they noticed, the only part they considered worth mentioning. They reacted as if I had toppled something they built, not something I'd been carrying on my back for over a decade. I let their words sit on the screen untouched, unread beyond the preview lines. There are times when silence is an act of defiance, but in moments like this, it becomes a declaration of truth. No explanation I could offer would rewrite the past into something they weren't ready to acknowledge. No amount of reasoning would make them see what they'd spent years refusing to see. It was early afternoon when I noticed the pattern shifting again. "Tyler, excuse me." Natasha's presence reemerged, not through her own words this time, but through the consequences she couldn't escape. A stack of missed calls from unfamiliar numbers filled my call log. Numbers I recognized as belonging to university offices, financial aid departments, housing coordinators. The pattern was too consistent to be random or coincidental. They came from administrative desks, from advisors who were trying to reach the guarantor listed on various accounts. Each call was a reminder that systems beyond my family had begun adjusting to the changes I'd triggered. Natasha's support structure had started folding in on itself, collapsing under its own weight, and she was scrambling, completely unprepared for how to navigate a world without the cushioning she'd taken for granted her entire adult life. I didn't listen to any of the voicemails these offices left. A sound of desperation, even institutional desperation, has a strange way of pulling people back into roles they're trying to escape. I wasn't giving myself that option. I wasn't opening that door even a crack. Instead, I spent the afternoon moving through my day with intention, teaching myself how to live without waiting for the next crisis call, without that constant low-level anxiety humming in the background. I prepared a proper lunch, something I rarely did during the work week. I stood by the window as the afternoon light shifted across the hardwood floors of my apartment. I let myself feel something I hadn't allowed in years. Distance. Not the cold, resentful kind that builds walls, just the natural space that appears when you stop bending yourself around other people's needs and expectations. Toward evening, a new message arrived, long and sprawling, dripping with the kind of personal attack people resort to when logic fails them and they have nothing left but cruelty. The sender didn't surprise me. The tone didn't either. But one line cut sharper than the rest. Not because it held any truth, but because it revealed everything they'd been thinking long before the retirement party, long before Natasha's public performance. Marcus accused me of being self-absorbed, of living a life built on loneliness and career obsession, of clinging to professional success because I had nothing else to fill the emptiness. He said I was jealous of his relationship with Natasha. Jealous that he had family? Well, I had only money. It was stunning how quickly entitlement twisted itself into cruelty, how effortlessly people drew blood when the person feeding them stopped offering their hands. But as I read through the message, something unexpected happened. I didn't feel wounded. I didn't feel that familiar ache of rejection or the sting of being misunderstood. I felt certain. Anchored. There comes a point when someone's cruelty stops feeling personal and starts feeling like a confession, like they're revealing exactly who they've always been beneath the surface. His words didn't show who I was. They showed who he had always been. Ungrateful, entitled, convinced the world owed him comfort, and that I specifically owed him comfort. That realization grounded me in a way nothing else could have. I closed the message without responding and reached for my laptop. If the storm was rising, if they were preparing to escalate, I would not be standing unprepared when it hit. The next steps came to me clearly, almost clinically, like following a checklist I'd unconsciously been preparing for years. I logged into the financial accounts still tied to my family, scanning through each automatic payment, each loan support structure, each recurring expense I'd forgotten I was even covering because they'd become so routine. The numbers formed a map of obligations I'd stopped recognizing as choices long ago. They'd become reflexes, automatic responses I never questioned. With steady hands and a surprisingly calm mind, I began shutting them down, one by one, not out of spite or revenge, but out of absolute necessity. There was a strange calm in the precision of it. In the methodical clicking through menus and confirmation screens, the credit line I'd extended to Marcus for home maintenance terminated. The monthly financial assistance I'd been quietly sending my parents to help with their mortgage disabled. The emergency fund I'd set up that Natasha had access to for unexpected expenses locked and closed. And of course, it was astonishing how many connections needed severing. Like cutting old threads from a tapestry, that had grown so heavy I could barely lift it anymore. Each severance felt like setting down another stone I'd been carrying. As the last confirmation email slipped into my inbox, a wave of clarity washed over me so profound it almost felt physical. I had spent years, over a decade really, cushioning their missteps, stitching together gaps they refused to acknowledge even existed, absorbing the impact of decisions they made without ever considering the consequences. Now, for the first time since I'd graduated from university, the weight of their choices wasn't mine to carry. The responsibility had returned to where it belonged, to the people who made those choices in the first place. I stepped outside onto my balcony, letting the evening air cool the heat that had built inside me throughout the day. Below, the city moved on, without knowing anything about the fissure widening within my family. Cars passed on the street. People walked their dogs. Lights flickered on in apartment windows across the way. It was humbling in a strange way, seeing how small personal storms looked against a backdrop of ordinary life continuing everywhere else. Somewhere in that stillness, watching the city breathe around me, I understood something important. Their anger wasn't proof I'd done something wrong. It was proof I'd finally done something they couldn't control, something they couldn't manipulate or guilt me out of. The consequences they were facing weren't punishments I'd designed to hurt them. They were simply the natural return of responsibility to the people it had always belonged to. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt ready for whatever came next. Not eager, not vindictive, just ready. Prepared to hold my ground no matter how hard they pushed, no matter what tactics they tried next. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community, so we can bring more truthful stories for you. There's a particular kind of silence that settles after people exhaust every strategy they know. Denial, anger, guilt, manipulation, and realize none of it is working anymore. That silence arrived about a week after I cut the last financial thread connecting me to their problems. It wasn't peaceful or reflective. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air before lightning strikes and everything changes. I first sensed the shift through the sudden absence of notifications. A phone that had been buzzing constantly for days sat motionless on my kitchen counter, as if holding its breath, waiting for something. I didn't trust the quiet. People don't change overnight, not really. They regroup, they strategize, they look for another door to slip through when the main entrance gets locked. And I knew my family well enough to understand that silence from them wasn't resolution or acceptance. It was recalibration. By midday, the silence cracked wide open. A single email appeared in my inbox, not from anyone I recognized immediately, but from an administrative coordinator at a community assistance center in my hometown. They had received an inquiry regarding urgent family financial assistance and wanted to confirm my involvement before proceeding with any aid applications. The moment I finished reading those carefully worded sentences, everything clicked into place with startling clarity. My family wasn't trying to fix the chaos they'd created. They weren't trying to adjust to the new reality or figure out how to stand on their own. They were trying to outsource the problem, to find a replacement for me, to locate another well they could draw from now that I'd run dry. It was a strange realization, almost surreal, watching them reroute their dependency without ever examining why things had unraveled in the first place. They weren't looking for solutions or sustainable changes. They were looking for substitutes, for anyone or anything that would restore their comfort level, as long as it wasn't their own effort or accountability. I deleted the email without responding, without even acknowledging it. Whatever narrative they were spinning to that community center, whatever sob story they'd constructed about sudden hardship and family crisis, it wasn't my responsibility to correct or confirm. Later that afternoon, another ripple reached me from an unexpected direction. A distant relative I hadn't spoken to in years, someone who never remembered my birthday or reached out just to check in. but who always somehow knew every detail of family drama, sent me a message. It was filled with concerned phrasing that didn't mask its actual purpose, fishing for information and probably stirring the pot. My family, she informed me with thinly veiled glee, had begun circulating a narrative throughout our extended family network, a story that painted themselves as victims of an abrupt financial crisis and me as the catalyst, the cold-hearted daughter and sister who had abandoned them in their time of need. It wasn't surprising at all. When people lose access to resources they'd taken for granted, they compensate by rewriting the story, by reshaping the narrative to preserve their own image. Their version of events framed me as stubborn and impulsive, a woman overwhelmed by emotion and professional stress, a daughter who had inexplicably walked away from her family responsibilities without warning or reason. What they conveniently left out, of course, were the years of quiet contributions that had kept them afloat, the countless sacrifices I'd made without ever asking for recognition. The emotional labor no one had ever acknowledged because it happened silently, in bank transfers and signed documents and problems solved before anyone else even knew they existed. Selective memory is a skill my family had mastered long before this crisis. They remembered every time I'd said no or hesitated, but somehow forgot the hundreds of times I'd said yes without being asked. The message from my distant relative didn't bother me the way it might have a month earlier. What struck me instead was how predictable it all felt, how quickly family dysfunction turns itself into a performance when the audience shifts. Everyone becomes an actor playing a part, and the truth becomes whatever version gets the most sympathy. As evening settled over the city, I stepped out onto my balcony again. It had become a ritual of sorts, this evening retreat into fresh air and perspective. The sky was dimming to deep purple, headlights flickering across the streets below in long, unbroken lines. I watched strangers move through their lives with an ease I hadn't felt in years. And somewhere inside that stillness, a question surfaced that I'd never allowed myself to ask before. Why had I ever believed their chaos was mine to manage? When had their emergencies become my emergencies? When had I stopped seeing myself as a separate person with my own life to build, and started seeing myself primarily as their safety net? It didn't last long. The peace didn't last long, of course. Around sunset, just as the streetlights were beginning to flicker on, my building's security desk called to inform me that someone had attempted to enter without clearance. They hadn't gotten past the lobby, the security guard assured me, but the description was unmistakable. My father had shown up unannounced, insistent and agitated, leaning heavily on the expectation that he could simply appear at my building and I would fall back into place like a puzzle piece returning to its slot. That detail didn't reassure me. The guard said my father eventually left, frustrated but maintaining his composure. That detail didn't reassure me. My father had always been skilled at presenting calmness like a mask, something to hide the urgency and sometimes anger pressing beneath the surface. His presence at my building wasn't about reconciliation or genuine conversation. It was about control, about reasserting the family hierarchy, about reminding me of my place in their structure. I thanked the security guard and asked him to note in the system that my father was not to be granted access under any circumstances. He agreed without hesitation, professional and understanding in a way that made me realize he'd probably handled similar situations before. Family drama that spills into apartment building lobbies isn't as rare as people might think. For the guilt to flood in, but it didn't come. Instead, I felt something steadier, harder to shake: resolve. An absolute certainty that I had made the right choice and that I needed to protect it, to reinforce the boundaries I'd established before they found ways to erode them. That night, I took additional steps to strengthen the distance between us. I disabled shared accounts I'd forgotten even existed, digital connections that had persisted simply because I'd never thought to sever them. I removed my information from family directories I hadn't checked in years. I adjusted settings on various systems that still listed me as an emergency contact for one family member or another. Every adjustment felt like tightening the seams of a boundary that had been fraying since the day I first learned to put others before myself. The next afternoon brought a different kind of disruption, something that caught me off guard in a way the messages and phone calls hadn't. A package appeared at my doorstep, no return label. No handwriting to identify the sender, just a plain cardboard box sitting there like a question waiting to be answered, or maybe a trap waiting to be sprung. I hesitated before bringing it inside, already bracing myself for whatever emotional manipulation it might contain. When I finally cut through the packing tape and opened the flaps, I found scattered pieces of my past, carefully, deliberately returned to me. Old birthday cards I'd sent to Natasha over the years, thank you notes I'd written to accompany gifts, small mementos I'd given her for various milestones, high school graduation, her first apartment, college acceptance. They had all been tossed together carelessly, thrown into the box as if they were trash someone was trying to dispose of quietly. No explanation accompanied them, no note, no apology. Just a box of discarded history sitting in my hallway, a box full of evidence that everything I'd given had meant nothing, or worse, had been resented. For a long moment, I stood completely still in my entryway. Not hurt exactly, but profoundly aware of what this gesture represented. This wasn't an attempt at reconciliation. This was retaliation, pure and simple. When people can't reach you emotionally, when they can't guilt you or manipulate you back into place, they look for ways to provoke you, to wound you, to remind you of your place in the hierarchy they've constructed. But the box accomplished something they hadn't intended. It clarified everything. It stripped away any lingering doubt I might have harbored about whether I was being too harsh, too cold, too unforgiving. This box of returned memories told me exactly how they'd always felt about my contributions. They'd tolerated them, accepted them, demanded them even, but they'd never valued them. And now that the contributions had stopped, they wanted to make sure I understood that the relationship had been transactional all along. I gathered each item carefully, placed them all back inside the box, and sealed it with deliberate precision. Then I walked it straight to a donation center, 3 blocks from my apartment building. I didn't linger over any of the items. I didn't second-guess the decision. I simply handed the box to the volunteer at the counter and felt something release inside me. One more thread snapping cleanly, one more weight lifted. That evening, as soft golden light filtered through my living room windows, I realized how far I'd traveled from the person who once answered every call immediately, who fixed every problem without being asked, who absorbed every careless word and cutting remark without defending herself. A distance between who I was then and who I had become felt vast, almost immeasurable. But it didn't feel lonely. It felt earned. They wanted a version of me who would bend until she broke, who would absorb infinite amounts of disrespect and financial burden without ever pushing back. They weren't getting her back. That version of Victoria Ashford no longer existed, and I wasn't done walking away from them. Not yet. The following days brought new complications, new attempts at breaking through the walls I'd built. Marcus showed up at my office building one afternoon, somehow getting past the ground floor security by claiming to be an important client. My assistant called me with concern in her voice, saying there was a man in the lobby who seemed upset and was insisting he needed to speak with me, urgently, about a family emergency. I told her to have security escort him out and to flag his name in the visitor system. I didn't go down to confront him. I didn't take his bait. I simply continued with my afternoon meetings as if nothing had happened, though I could feel my heart racing beneath my professional exterior. An hour later, Marcus sent a message that vibrated with barely controlled rage. He accused me of embarrassing him, of having him removed from my building like a criminal, of treating family like strangers. He said I'd changed into someone he didn't recognize, someone cold and corporate and heartless. He said our parents were ashamed of me, that Natasha was suffering because of my selfishness, that I was destroying the family over a silly joke that I'd taken too seriously. A silly joke. That's what he called it. As if Natasha's public humiliation of me was just harmless fun. As if my years of financial support entitled them to mock me in front of everyone we knew. As if respect was optional when you were dealing with family. I didn't respond to that message either. Every word he wrote only confirmed that I'd made the right choice. They would never see what they'd done wrong. They would never acknowledge the years of imbalance or the casual cruelty of that night. They would only see my withdrawal of support as an attack on them, as something irrational and mean-spirited that had come out of nowhere. My mother tried a different approach entirely. She sent a long, rambling email late one night, the kind of message people write when they can't sleep and convince themselves that if they can just find the right words, everything will go back to normal. She wrote about family history, about sacrifices she and my father had made, about how family is supposed to stick together through difficult times. She reminded me of every time they helped me as a child, conveniently inflating normal parenting duties into extraordinary sacrifices. She painted a picture of a loving, supportive family that had always been there for each other, carefully editing out every time I'd been the only one doing the supporting. She ended with a plea, asking me to remember who I was, to remember the values I'd been raised with, to come home, literally and figuratively. The manipulation was so transparent it was almost insulting. But I understood the tactic. When direct confrontation doesn't work, when anger doesn't work, you try nostalgia. You try guilt wrapped in sentimentality. You paint a false picture of the past and hope the person you're manipulating has a faulty enough memory to believe it. I archived the email without responding. I wasn't going to debate my own history with people who had spent years rewriting it to suit their needs. 2 weeks after I'd cut off the financial support, the real consequences began showing themselves in ways that went beyond angry messages and surprise visits. Natasha's loft situation reached a crisis point. Without my name on the lease and without my guaranteed backing, the property management company initiated eviction proceedings. She had 30 days to either secure her own financial qualification or vacate the premises. The university sent formal notices about her tuition status. Without the automatic payments that had been flowing from my account, her enrollment was at risk. She had until the end of the semester to resolve the outstanding balance or face academic suspension. I learned these details not from my family, who had stopped trying to reach me directly, but from the automated systems that still had my email on file for various accounts. Each notification that arrived felt like watching dominoes fall, one consequence triggering the next. Everything I'd been preventing through sheer financial willpower finally happening because I'd stepped away. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory or vindication, just a quiet, sad acknowledgement that this had always been inevitable. Without addressing the fundamental problems, without learning to function independently, without developing any sense of financial responsibility, they had always been headed toward this collision with reality. I had simply been delaying it, cushioning the blow, making it possible for them to avoid consequences indefinitely. Now the consequences had arrived, and I wasn't there to absorb them. Marcus called from an unknown number one evening, managing to get through because I didn't recognize it in time to decline. His voice was different when I answered. Not angry anymore, but desperate, pleading. He asked if we could talk, really talk, without all the emotion and accusations. He said things had gotten out of hand, that maybe everyone had said things they didn't mean, that families should be able to work through disagreements. I listened without interrupting, letting him exhaust his practiced speech. When he finished, when the silence stretched between us waiting for my response, I said just one thing. Marcus, you called Natasha's cruelty a silly joke. That told me everything I needed to know about how you've always seen me. I'm not angry anymore. I'm just done. Then I hung up and blocked that number too. The message was clear, at least to me. I wasn't punishing them. I wasn't trying to teach them a lesson or force an apology. I was simply removing myself from a dynamic that had been damaging me for years, and if my absence created problems for them, those were their problems to solve, not mine. My parents made one final attempt to break through my boundaries, and it was perhaps the most manipulative of all. They sent a letter, an actual handwritten letter delivered through the postal service, because they knew I'd blocked their numbers and filtered their emails. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 days before I opened it, and even then, I almost threw it away unread. The letter was written in my mother's careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had filled out permission slips and birthday cards throughout my childhood. She wrote about family obligation, about the importance of forgiveness, about how I was hurting not just them, but myself by cutting everyone off. She said that holding grudges was poison, that I needed to let go of my pride and remember what really mattered. She also mentioned, almost as an afterthought in the final paragraph, that they were facing some financial difficulties themselves. Medical bills were piling up. The house needed repairs they couldn't afford. They weren't asking for help, she assured me, just letting me know what was happening in their lives in case I cared. It was masterfully done, really. The emotional manipulation woven seamlessly with the subtle financial request, the guilt layered with just enough pride to make it seem like they weren't actually asking for money, even though they clearly were. I folded the letter carefully, placed it back in its envelope, and filed it away in a drawer. Not because I was saving it for sentimental reasons, but because I wanted to remember this moment, this clarity. This understanding of exactly how my family operated. They would never change. They would never take responsibility. They would only continue finding new ways to extract resources while making me feel guilty for having boundaries. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I called my closest friend from university, Elizabeth. Someone I'd lost touch with because I'd been so consumed with managing my family's crises that I'd neglected my own relationships. We talked for 2 hours, and I told her everything, the whole story from beginning to present. She listened without judgment, and when I finished, she said something that hit me harder than I expected. Victoria, you're not responsible for raising your brother. You're not responsible for parenting your niece. You're not responsible for funding your parents' retirement. You were just the person they decided to exploit because you let them. And good for you for finally stopping. Hearing it stated so plainly by someone outside the situation, someone with no stake in the family dynamics, crystallized something for me. I hadn't been helping them, not merely. I'd been enabling their dysfunction, making it possible for them to avoid growing up, taking responsibility, making hard choices. My support, which I'd always framed as love and family duty, had actually been harmful in the long run because it removed all incentive for them to change. The weeks that followed brought more news from the periphery of my family's circle. Natasha had moved back in with Marcus, her loft abandoned after she couldn't meet the property company's requirements. The university had placed her on financial probation, and she dropped down to part-time status to reduce costs. Marcus had taken on additional work driving for a rideshare company on weekends to help cover expenses. Monaskele and my parents had stopped mentioning their financial difficulties, at least in any messages that reached me through various channels, which suggested they'd either found solutions or were too proud to keep asking through intermediaries. My parents had stopped mentioning their financial difficulties, at least in any messages that reached me through various channels. None of these developments came to me directly. They filtered through acquaintances, through social media posts I saw before people realized I was watching, through the kind of ambient information that spreads through communities whether you want it to or not. Each piece of news felt like confirmation that they were surviving, adapting, doing what they needed to do without me. It wasn't the life they wanted, probably wasn't the life they felt they deserved, but it was a life they were building with their own efforts for once. And slowly, gradually, I began rebuilding my own life in the space their absence had created. I reconnected with old friends I'd neglected. I took a weekend trip to Portland, just because I wanted to, not because I was visiting family or fulfilling an obligation. I started learning Italian through an online course, something I'd always wanted to do but never had time for. My work performance improved dramatically once I wasn't constantly distracted by family crises. I received a significant promotion about 2 months after cutting ties, moving into a senior director position I'd been working toward for years. The increased salary felt different than previous raises had. For the first time, it was mine entirely, not money that would immediately get redirected to someone else's emergency. I bought myself things without guilt, not extravagant purchases, just small luxuries I'd always denied myself because I was too busy funding other people's needs. A good espresso machine, fresh flowers every week, a membership to a pottery studio I'd been eyeing for years. The quiet continued, stretched into months, and gradually transformed from something unsettling into something peaceful. My apartment felt like my own space again instead of a temporary refuge between family crises. My phone didn't fill me with dread every time it buzzed. My bank account balance became something I checked with satisfaction instead of anxiety. There were moments of doubt, of course. Late nights when I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving. Moments when I questioned whether cutting them off completely had been necessary or just cruel. But then I would remember Natasha's face as she humiliated me in front of everyone we knew. I would remember Marcus calling it a silly joke. I would remember years of being taken for granted, of having my contributions dismissed, of being valued only for what I could provide financially. And the doubt would fade, replaced by certainty that I had done exactly what I needed to do, to survive, to preserve myself, to refuse to be diminished any further. 6 months after my father's retirement party, I received an unexpected message from Natasha herself. Not angry or demanding, but tentative, almost careful. She asked if we could talk, said she had some things she wanted to say, things she'd been thinking about for a while. She didn't apologize in the message, didn't acknowledge what she'd done, but the tone was different enough to catch my attention. I thought about it for several days before responding. Part of me wanted to ignore it entirely, to maintain the clean break I'd established. But another part, a smaller, quieter part, was curious about what had changed, what had happened in those 6 months that made her reach out now, see it her friend, and promise not to say anything. Split time, 1 hour maximum. And I made it clear in my response that I wasn't interested in being recruited back into the family's financial support system, that if that was the purpose of the meeting, we could cancel now. She agreed to my conditions without argument, which was itself surprising. We met on a Wednesday afternoon at a coffee shop downtown, far from any neighborhoods where we might run into family members or family friends. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting at a corner table, looking smaller somehow than I remembered. Not physically smaller, but diminished, like someone who'd been carrying weight they weren't prepared for. She stood when she saw me, uncertain whether to hug or shake hands or just sit back down. I solved the problem by sitting immediately, keeping the table between us as a clear boundary. She sat across from me, wrapping her hands around a coffee cup she didn't seem to be drinking from. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then she took a breath and began. "I need to apologize," she said, and her voice was steadier than I expected. "What I said at Grandpa's party was cruel. It was meant to get laughs, and I didn't think about how it would actually affect you. I didn't think about how much you'd done for me, for us. I just saw you as the aunt with money, and I made you into a joke because it was easy. I listened without interrupting, watching her face carefully for signs of manipulation or performance. She seemed genuine, but I'd been fooled before by people who were good at seeming genuine. The last 6 months have been really hard, she continued. Not just because of the money stuff, though that's been really hard too, but because I've had to actually figure things out on my own for the first time. Dad and I have had to figure things out, and I've realized how much you were doing that I never saw, never appreciated, never even thanked you for. She paused, looking down at her coffee. I had to drop to part-time at school. I'm working 25 hours a week at a retail job to help Dad with expenses. I had to give up the loft and move back home. Everything changed so fast, and at first I just blamed you for all of it. I was so angry at you for abandoning us, for being selfish, for punishing everyone over one stupid comment. How much everything cost. And I realized you've been paying for basically my entire life for years, and I never once said thank you. I just expected it. We all did. I remained silent, letting her words settle in the space between us. This was her apology to give, not a conversation for me to facilitate or make easier for her. And she asked if I don't expect you to forgive me, Natasha said quietly. I don't expect things to go back to how they were. I just needed you to know that I understand now what I did, how wrong it was, and I'm sorry. Really, genuinely sorry. When she finished, the silence stretched between us again. I took a sip of my coffee, organizing my thoughts before responding. Thank you for apologizing, I finally said. That takes courage, and I appreciate it. But you need to understand something, Natasha. What hurt me wasn't just what you said at the party. It was that everyone laughed. Your father laughed the loudest. Your grandparents said nothing. And afterward, when I set boundaries, when I stopped being the family bank, everyone treated me like I was the villain. No one asked themselves why I might be hurt or angry. No one examined their own behavior. They just decided I was being irrational and mean. She nodded slowly, looking down at her hands. I know. Dad still doesn't really get it. Grandma and Grandpa think you're being stubborn and holding a grudge. They think family is supposed to forgive everything automatically. Family is supposed to respect each other too, I said quietly. And I wasn't respected. I was used. There's a difference between helping family and being taken advantage of by family. And it took me way too long to see which one was actually happening. I get that now, she said. I really do. Working this retail job, watching every dollar, figuring out how to budget, it's shown me what you must have been dealing with for years. How you must have been stressing about our stuff on top of your own stuff. And we just kept asking for more. We talked for another 20 minutes, not about reconciliation or rebuilding our relationship, but just about life, about what she was studying, about my work, about neutral topics that felt surprisingly comfortable given everything that had happened. When the hour I'd allotted was nearly up, I prepared to leave. I hope things work out for you, I told her honestly. I hope you finish school and build the career you want. But I need you to understand that I'm not going back to being what I was before. I'm not going to be the family's safety net anymore. Whatever happens from here, you all need to handle it yourselves. I understand, she said, standing as I gathered my things. And for what it's worth, I think you're right to do that. We never should have depended on you the way we did. It wasn't fair to you. As I walked out of that coffee shop, I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness exactly, not reconciliation, but a small sense of closure. Natasha's apology didn't erase what had happened or what they'd all done, but it acknowledged reality in a way no one else in my family had been willing to do. That acknowledgement mattered, even if it couldn't repair what had been broken. I didn't rush to restore contact with her after that meeting. I didn't offer to help with her expenses or her tuition. But I did send her a brief message a few days later, thanking her again for the apology and wishing her well. She responded with gratitude, and we left it at that. Small, careful, boundaried. Not the relationship we'd had before, but perhaps the beginning of something more honest, more balanced, if we both chose to build it. The rest of my family remained distant, wrapped in their own narrative about my coldness and betrayal. I heard through various channels that Marcus still painted himself as the victim of my irrationality. My parents still believed I was holding an unnecessary grudge over nothing. They had learned nothing, changed nothing, and I had no expectation that they ever would. And strangely, that was okay. I had released the need for them to understand or acknowledge what they'd done. I had released the hope that they would eventually see things clearly and apologize. Some people never develop that kind of self-awareness, and you can't force them into it, no matter how much evidence you provide or how clearly you explain things. All you can do is protect yourself, establish boundaries, and build a life that doesn't revolve around their dysfunction. So that's what I did. A year after my father's retirement party, I stood on my balcony on a warm evening, watching the city lights flicker on as the sun set behind the buildings. My phone sat inside on the kitchen counter, silent and peaceful. My calendar was full of plans I'd made for myself, trips and classes and dinners with friends I'd reconnected with. My bank account was healthy, growing steadily, funding my own dreams for once instead of everyone else's emergencies. I thought about that night at the party sometimes, about standing there with a plate of cake while laughter crashed over me like a wave. I thought about how small I'd felt, how humiliated, how certain that I'd done something wrong just by existing in a way that made me easy to mock. But I didn't feel small anymore. I didn't feel like I'd done anything wrong. I had simply been generous with people who mistook generosity for weakness, who confused love with obligation, who believed family meant unlimited access to someone else's resources without requiring respect in return. Walking away from them wasn't cruelty. It was survival. It was choosing myself after decades of choosing everyone else. It was recognizing that peace doesn't arrive when other people change. It arrives when you stop shrinking yourself to fit into the space they've designated for their convenience. You can love people from a distance. You can care without sacrificing yourself. And you're allowed, even obligated, to walk away from anyone who only loves the version of you that benefits them without costing them anything. I didn't lose a family that night at the retirement party. I lost the illusion that I'd ever had one, at least one that valued me as more than a resource to be exploited. And in losing that illusion, in walking away from that pattern of use and disrespect, I found something far more valuable. I found myself again, the version of me that existed before I learned to set myself on fire to keep others warm. A version who had dreams and boundaries and the right to be treated with basic respect and dignity. That version of Victoria Ashford had been buried under years of obligation and guilt and family pressure. But she hadn't disappeared. She'd just been waiting for permission to exist again, waiting for me to decide that I mattered as much as everyone I'd been supporting. That permission didn't come from them. It never would have. It came from me, from the choice I made to walk out of that banquet hall and keep walking until I'd traveled far enough to see the whole picture clearly. And from that distance, with that clarity, I could finally see the truth. The problem was never that I couldn't take a joke. The problem was that my entire existence in their lives had become a joke, a punchline, a convenient source of money and support that didn't require them to offer anything in return, not even respect. So I stopped being that person. I stopped playing that role. And if that made me cold or selfish or unforgiving in their eyes, I could live with that judgment. Because I'd rather be cold and whole than warm and destroyed. That's not the ending I expected when I set down that plate of cake and walked out into the parking lot alone. But it's the ending I needed, the ending I chose, the ending I built for myself when I finally understood that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself, and paradoxically even for others, is to let them face the consequences of their own choices without cushioning the impact. They survived without me. They're still surviving, adapting, figuring things out. And I'm doing more than surviving. I'm actually living. Maybe for the first time since I graduated from university and unknowingly became the family's designated safety net. If you feel my words, show your support by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And tell me from which city you belong, so I can see how far a woman's impactful voice can reach. Help me build this community so we can bring more truthful stories for you. This is my truth. This is my story. And if it resonates with you, if you've ever been the person everyone depends on but nobody respects, if you've ever been mocked for your generosity or punished for setting boundaries, I want you to know something important. You're not wrong for walking away. You're not cruel for choosing yourself. You're not obligated to set yourself on fire just because other people are cold. And you deserve relationships built on mutual respect and genuine love, not transactions disguised as family bonds. Peace doesn't come from being needed. It comes from being valued. And if the people in your life can't tell the difference, if they only appreciate what you provide and never who you are, then maybe the most powerful thing you can do is step back and let them figure out life without you. That's what I did, and a year later, standing on my balcony, watching a city that doesn't know my name or my story, I can honestly say it was the best decision I ever made. Not because it hurt them, though it did. Not because it taught them a lesson, though maybe for one of them it started to. But because it saved me. Because it gave me back my life, my resources, my time, my energy, my peace of mind. And in the end, that's what mattered most. Not their understanding or approval or even their apology. The one eventually came from an unexpected source. What mattered was that I finally understood my own worth, established boundaries that protected it, and built a life that honored it. That's the real revenge, if you want to call it that. Not hurting the people who hurt you, but healing yourself so completely that their opinion of you becomes irrelevant. Not punishing them for their cruelty, but freeing yourself from the need for their validation. I didn't lose anything when I walked away from my family. I reclaimed everything they'd taken from me over the years. My dignity, my resources, my peace, myself. And I would make that same choice again without hesitation every single time, because I finally learned the most important lesson of all. You can't help people who don't want to change. You can't force people to respect you. And you can't build genuine relationships with people who only see you as a means to an end. All you can do is recognize those truths, accept them, and walk away with your head high and your boundaries firm. Let them figure out their own lives while you finally start living yours. That's exactly what I did, and I've never looked back with regret. Only with relief that I found the strength to choose myself when everyone else expected me to keep choosing them. This is Victoria Ashford, signing off. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it helps someone out there find the courage to write their own ending, one where they matter just as much as everyone they've been supporting. You deserve that. Remember that. You deserve it.